The engine is out of the Ferrari, and we are partway through the biggest, worst job left on the list, finishing the engine bay. We've still got a lot of welding to do, paint prep to do, and painting, but I'm hopeful by the end of the next episode we'll have all that stuff done and the engine going back into the car for the last time, or at least be really close to it. Before I pulled the motor out, I got the last engine bay thing crossed off the checklist. I've got the waterline run to the turbo. That is done. This engine is ready to be run for an extended period of time. And I built a new dolly for the car to roll around on because it's kind of necessary at this point. It made a world of difference. We've got a lot of stuff to cover in this episode, so let's dive in. And if you want to show some support for the channel, subscribe, leave a comment, or snag those new StanceWorks shirts if you haven't. Right now, we are under a serious push to get this car complete. So the past few episodes have been an all-out blitz to cross everything we can off of the final checklist. In the last episode, we finalized our oil catch can setup, which means there's only one thing left on the list that's critical to the engine itself. Our Garrett turbo is a water-cooled turbo, which means we need to find a way to supply cold coolant to it, and then a way to return hot coolant back into the system. Garrett says that it's okay to supply coolant that's already been through the engine. As long as it's under 250 degrees by the time it reaches the turbo, it'll still do its job, but Rob at Tuff offered an alternative suggestion, so let's try it. Located just above the oil inlet port of the engine is a coolant port that was blocked off by Honda from the factory. While I don't know what the original intent for this port is, I do know that if we open it up, it gives us access to coolant before it has circulated through the engine. It sits just opposite the water inlet. But instead of pulling that plug and spilling water everywhere, we're going to pull the hose off of the water pump and spill water everywhere instead. By covering everything in coolant instead of covering everything in coolant, we can now pull this plug without making a massive mess. In place of the plug that comes out, we're going to be using Tuff's adapter fitting. This threads into that port and gives us a stainless steel -6 AN fitting as a water outlet. This is, to my understanding, very similar to a Honda S2000 part used to get oil from the block into the oil cooler. But just like the Honda part, this does not have sealing threads. They're not tapered and there's no O-ring. So we're going to use some thread sealant to make sure this thing seals up nicely and we can install it in the block. Of all the options for coolant supply for the turbo, this seems by far the best and easiest to pull off. Now we just need to plumb it in. The port we just installed on the block is only about a foot away from the inlet on the turbo, so the hose was more or less a straight shot. But now we need to figure out how we're going to get this coolant back into the cooling system. Following Rob at Tuff's suggestion, I sent the coolant line back to the inlet of our water pump. But before we go hooking anything up, we need to change this fitting. Many moons ago, one or several of you guys commented and said I needed to order these specialty Mazir water pump fittings. You'll notice if you look at the threads in comparison to a normal adapter, they are considerably shorter on the specialty part. I guess it's a blessing we didn't power anything up because we could have damaged the impeller on the pump. But now with these new fittings installed, we are ready for business. But the question is, how will we splice our return line into the feed? The answer is a custom-ordered -20 sensor housing. We've got a female on one end and a male on the other for it to sit in line, but it also has a port, initially meant for a sensor, but in our case, perfect for returning coolant to the main line of flow. Now, with our line finished, we're just waiting on that adapter fitting to go in here. It was a custom order because it's a -20 fitting, and a -20 sensor fitting is not a common one. The other added benefit here is that the water flowing through the main line should have a good siphoning or venturi effect and help draw water out of the turbo before it goes back into the motor. Now, I have some concerns about taking that hot water and just sending it right back into the motor, mixing with the cold water after it's gone through the radiator. But I've talked to a few people, they seem to think this should be totally fine. If we have heat problems and heat management issues, we'll take this water from the turbo and send it all the way back to the hot side of the radiator so that it can get cooled down with everything else, but I really don't think that should be necessary. At least that's what some trustworthy people tell me. This is the right place to do this, and we'll keep this system short and to the point. So, done. We just need one fitting, but with that finished, let's start taking everything apart. And now begins the largest teardown of this car that I've undertaken since I started this build. I want to pull every single component out of the engine bay and off of the back end in preparation for welding and paint. Now, to be clear, I'm only talking about painting the engine bay and the chassis. We're going to save the outside of the car for a later time. But it's a necessary step and it requires removing everything we've attached to this car so far. This did offer a cool chance, though, to see all of the parts laid out for the first time. Some that I've made, some that I've bought, all of them exciting to see laid out on the shop floor. The only one I'm not truly thrilled with is that turbo manifold, given it was my first TIG project. I've come a long way since I built this thing, but I'll redo it in the future. Otherwise, everything else I'm excited to see in a finished engine bay. To get there, though, we need to put the car back on a dolly, and some of you guys may remember the wooden one the car has been perched atop of for most of the past 2 years. The problem is, by the time we finally got the car off of it, it was on its last legs, cracking in certain areas, not to mention the fact that the casters I used were cheap and definitely not rated for this kind of load. This thing was all but impossible to push around the shop by myself, so we need to redo this and make it better. I took the daily driver over to the metal supply shop and bought some 2x3 120 wall steel beams so that we can make a dolly better suited to this job and for any job I might have for it in the future. It's certainly overkill, but that's kind of my style. After unloading the material from the truck, I got out the trusty chop saw, which I haven't used in years, only to find out I probably haven't used it in years because the blade is completely worn out. I don't want to waste time going to get another blade, so we're going to use a circular saw to cut this stuff, which might surprise some of you. With a proper metal cutting blade on this thing, you can cut 120 wall steel tubing with no problems at all. In fact, it'll make gorgeous cuts, with the only real drawback being it sounds terrible while you're using it. As far as design goes, I just want to replicate the wooden dolly that we had before. It certainly wasn't elegant, but I don't want to spend any more time than necessary on this thing because we have a car to get done. With everything mocked up, it's time to weld it, and the right tool for this job is the Miller MIG. I've had this 211 auto set for about 10 years now, and I can't recommend it enough. It's a 120 and 240 volt machine. It can weld pretty much anything you throw at it, and it's amazing for beginners. You can even see all of my notes for different settings as I was learning to use this thing. It was only about $900 new, and it looks like used they fetch about $500, so if you're looking for a good entry-level MIG, this is definitely the one I suggest. But enough talking. Let's get to work. As an ode to our friends over at Bad Obsession Motorsports, let's dial in this welder, and then let's turn on my version of a tea kettle and get out the funk, because it's time to weld. Now, we haven't done much MIG welding on this channel, so we haven't taken many opportunities to talk about it. Everyone's bound to have a different opinion about whether to push or pull and what type of shape to draw while they MIG weld, but my tactic is simple. I zigzag back and forth with small C shapes. I also always pull when possible. But don't take my word for it. The best tactic is to see what works best for you. Everybody's a little bit different. Next on the list, we need some casters for our dolly. And for casters, I went all out. I've tried pretty much every cheap option found in hardware stores like Home Depot, so this time around I ordered some $400 casters from McMaster. That might be overkill, but look at these things. They are huge, with 8-inch diameter wheels, and each one is load rated for more than 2,000 pounds, which means I shouldn't have any issues trying to push this thing around by myself. These things come with bolt holes, but instead of bolting them to the dolly, I want to weld them into place, partially because drilling that many holes in that much material would suck. There's a lot of prep work involved though. I don't want to melt the rubber wheels, and I don't want to cook the bearings, so everything's got to come apart, and there's a lot of red powder coating to remove as well. With everything welded into place and then cooled down properly, it's time for final assembly. As mentioned, this thing is anything but elegant, but it sure is sturdy and it'll do exactly what we need it to do. All that's left is to actually find out how well it rolls. So let's get it underneath the 308 and pull it off of the lift for the first time in over a month. And then finally, the moment of truth. Was spending all this money on casters and rebuilding this thing worthwhile? I don't know if I can really say that casters are worth $400, but I can say I should have done this years ago. This car has never moved around so easily. I wish I had easily accessed footage of me trying to move the car around on the Old Dolly. It was borderline impossible to do solo. I mean, anytime I moved this car around by myself in the shop, it took me an hour to do. There was lots of swearing, lots of cursing, lots of sweating. It just didn't roll effectively. It was a nightmare. Even with two people, it was tough. And now, I can push this thing by myself with ease. It's incredible. I was nervous about spending this much money on casters, but totally worth it. So if you're gonna build something like this, do the same. Worth every penny. Now there's still a few other parts that need to come off of the car, the main one being the wing uprights and mounts that are bolted to the chassis. With 8 bolts in total, this thing comes off, and you can see how we'll be able to run an unmodified original engine cover if we want to go with that wingless look in the future. Here is where we should pull the engine out, but honestly, I'm a bit fixated on the details, so as any normal, well-adjusted person would do, I'm going to modify all of the engine mounts here as we're this close to the finish line. The reasoning is a little bit stupid, but after staring at this car for the past 2 years, I noticed that the engine was out of square in the engine bay by about 1/4 of a degree, and that's not good enough. So, let's get this thing perfect before we finalize everything permanently. At the beginning of this project, controlling the pedal between my knees while laying on the floor welding upside down would have been nothing short of a nightmare. But I get more confident every time I handle this torch, so this was no big deal this time around. With the engine mounts firmly tacked into place, the engine can finally come out of the car for what will hopefully be the last time before this car is actually driving. I'll probably regret immortalizing that in a video, and you guys can hold my feet to the fire in the comments when inevitably this engine comes back out again, but I'm going to keep my fingers crossed and keep the confidence up. Thanks to our new dolly, I can easily push the car out of the way from under the engine instead of swinging the engine around on the gantry and risking damaging that rear window. As you guys can see, there's a huge difference in the amount of movement involved depending on which one I'm moving. And with that, we're done. At least done with that part. There's still a fuel cell that needs to come out of the engine bay, as well as a lot of stuff that's bolted to the firewall. But with those parts out, we can finally take a look at what lies ahead of us in the engine bay. Sure, there's still some odds and ends that need to come out, like a filler neck, and the battery that's tucked in the corner, and the brake lines, and the stuff that's still bolted to the firewall, and the coolant hoses that can't come out. Alright, so maybe there's more in this engine bay than I thought there was, but we can still see what we're working with, which is a lot of rust. It's probably inevitable given that the shop is only about a half mile from the ocean as the crow flies, but what's kind of interesting, at least to me, is this rust seems to be from fallout in the air. If you look at where the pedestals for the wings sat, they covered up the sheet metal, and no rust is to be found. The same goes for underneath the car. Any surfaces that aren't horizontal tend to not rust at all. But I digress. We need to get this rust cleaned up, and there is a lot of welding that needs to get finished up in this engine bay. My plan is to have a mobile sandblaster come out and blast the back half of this car. That'll give us clean surfaces to weld and paint on. There is one last fabrication project I want to tackle before we get to the finish line though, and that's these mounts for the lower control arms off of the chassis. As you can see, they're mounted with a stud through the chassis, and this makes sense for a factory camber adjustment, but I don't really think it's the strongest way to do this. I'd rather just replace these with a simple tab coming off the chassis that replicates the same shape that I know will be significantly stronger. But that should be an easy project. The big one I can't solve is the fact that no matter what, I'm not really sure I'm going to be happy with the state of this engine bay even when it's finished, because admittedly, it's just kind of ugly. Forgive the talking head segment, but honestly I think the part that I'm most unhappy with on this car is the chassis or the engine bay. I mean, what I have added looks fine, and overall, yeah, it looks fine. It'll look a lot better all painted black in one color, but Ferrari did such a bad job on this. It looks terrible, and no matter what I do, it's putting lipstick on a pig. It's just not gonna look good. And if I had known what I was getting into when I started this project, I initially said, oh, I just want to engine swap a car. I didn't really plan on redesigning all of the suspension and then redesigning pretty much the rest of the car along with it. I probably should have just started and done a tube chassis from the get-go. I kind of wish I had. I don't have regrets on it, but it probably would have turned out a bit better. I'll be interested in seeing how the engine bay looks once we get it all painted. Hopefully black hides Ferrari's crimes, it hides some of my crimes, and it makes the nice work stand out, which will be the engine and all the fabricated components with it. That's my hope, at least. So we'll get to it. I've got a lot of welding to do in here. I'm a little bit stressed about it. It's a lot of TIG work. I should make some of it, but I'm gonna TIG everything that I can. I need to practice. Turn out better, look better, feel good about it. Should be good, worthwhile, I think, hopefully. Let's talk about paint. Now, we're gonna talk a lot about paint in the next episode once we're laying paint down, and I'm pretty sure I'm gonna use Steelit to paint this thing. This stuff has a lot of awesome qualities to it. It is basically stainless steel in a can. It comes in silver and black, and it's got like a polyurethane element to it, but that burns off. You can actually weld on this stuff on the car. You don't have to clean it up, and it welds really well. It offers a lot of corrosion protection. It's very resilient, it's easy to use, but since we're gonna be using this stuff, I'm gonna take a second and talk about an alternative just because I like spreading the gospel of good paint. No, neither of these companies paid me. I'm just talking about good stuff here. Seymour MRO paint. Everyone I've ever told about this stuff has never heard of it. I use this for everything, including the Model A chassis, Rusty's chassis. People always ask, oh, what color is this powder coat? This stuff lays so well. It's the best spray paint money you can buy if you're asking me. I get this stuff from a local metal supply place, so I don't know where to tell you guys to get it, but it's not cheap. It's incredible. You cannot run this stuff. If you manage to run it, you have really slipped up. You made a mistake. It lays so well. It's really resilient. They've got a lot of color options. Best spray paint money you can buy right here. I'm telling you. But because I can't weld through it, and I know at some point I'm gonna wish I could, and I don't wanna have to clean everything off of the chassis if I've gotta make some emergency repair. I think for future-proofing this car, we're gonna go with a weldable paint. Steelit should do it. It's got really good corrosive protection. So there you go, a little bit of paint talk. This stuff is good, buy some, always have some on the shelf. Have some Steelit too, it's good too. All right, that's enough paint talk, I guess. That's enough talking, let's be done. Well, I think that probably rounds out all of the blabbering I'm gonna do in this episode. That's enough talking. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Hopefully we'll get a mobile sandblaster out here this week or early next week so we can get the day all cleaned up. We'll get all the welding done. We'll get some paint thrown in and get this thing back together. I know I've been saying it, but I feel like we're finally on the home stretch of this thing. It's feeling really close. I've still got some other fabrication to do. Got to figure out an interior, but there's not much left on this list, and this is the biggest thing, the biggest hurdle. I've been dreading it for months. We're halfway through it. I feel pretty good. Anyways, with that said, make sure you guys snag some shirts if you haven't yet, or I've got a couple garage banners left. I think there's maybe 4 or 5 of them left. You guys bought out everything else. Your support means a ton to me. I can't thank you guys enough. Thanks for making this build happen. Thank you guys for watching along. I'm excited for next week and the next episode. I'll see you then.